The story follows a young woman named Lizaveta Finra's Day, born into the prestigious family of the Margrave of Finra. Her life took a dramatic turn when, through a marriage of convenience, she was wed to a member of the royal family, assuming the name Elizabeth Albert. Her union with His Highness Prince Leonhard shocked aristocratic society. Many noble women, upon hearing of the marriage, were baffled. Elizabeth was the prince's 10th concubine, an unlikely choice for a royal bride. Some of these women felt relieved they had not been chosen to marry the prince, fearing the marriage would have brought them misfortune. Rumors swirled about Prince Leonhard having a favored concubine, and Elizabeth, it seemed, was simply a political pawn in the eyes of many. From the perspective of the Finra family, however, this marriage was a strategic victory. They saw it as an opportunity to gain influence within the royal circle. In fact, many believed the match had been orchestrated by the crown to secure control over the valuable Finra mines, a key asset in the region. The public was well aware of the gossip. This marriage was seen as a business transaction, one designed to strengthen the royal family's grip on wealth and resources. Elizabeth herself was fully conscious of this dynamic but remained hopeful that her union might bring prosperity to her family's lands. Though hers was not a marriage founded on love, she was determined to make the best of it. On her wedding day, she resigned herself to her fate, knowing that the marriage was simply a political arrangement. After the wedding, as was custom, Elizabeth anticipated the wedding night. However, Prince Leonhard did not come to her. Instead, he spent the night with his beloved concubine, leaving Elizabeth to face the stark reality of her situation. She was not a cherished bride, rather, she was little more than a means to an end, an accessory to the Finra mines. Days turned into weeks, and Elizabeth's life in the royal palace settled into a quiet routine. She rarely saw her husband, who remained enamored with his concubine. Elizabeth's isolation was palpable, yet she kept herself occupied. Letters became her sole connection to the outside world. At that time, letters were delivered by special birds, a common practice for communication over long distances. The palace had a dedicated post office, managed by a man responsible for receiving and dispatching correspondence. One morning, a maid named Elsa visited the post office to collect Elizabeth's letters. The clerk handed her several envelopes, mentioning that 3 new letters had just arrived for the young mistress. Elsa thanked him and set off to deliver them to Elizabeth. As she walked through the palace, she overheard a conversation between some of the other maids. One laughed, commenting on how Elizabeth, despite being the prince's concubine, had secluded herself in her chambers, seemingly content to do nothing but write and receive letters. The other maids found Elizabeth's behavior peculiar but unsurprising. They knew she was the 10th concubine, an afterthought in the prince's life, and her isolation had become a frequent topic of gossip. However, Elsa paid no mind to their words. She had grown used to the palace staff's chatter and did not let it affect her. When Elsa reached Elizabeth's chambers, she knocked gently and called out her name. Elizabeth, seated on her bed, smiled upon hearing Elsa's voice and invited her in. As Elsa entered the room, Elizabeth greeted her warmly and, with a note of surprise, inquired whether she had received another letter. Elsa confirmed that 3 new letters had arrived that morning. The girl's eyes brightened at the thought. Letters were her only solace in an otherwise lonely life. Letters from Mr. Luard, Mr. Viola, and Mr. Liam arrived that fateful day. Elizabeth, upon hearing Elsa mention these names, was taken aback, her curiosity piqued. She immediately reached for the elegant black envelope, thanking Elsa for her service and apologizing for any trouble caused. Elizabeth, after all, was a woman her husband barely acknowledged. His affections lay elsewhere. As the 10th concubine, she had no official duties to occupy her time. One day, while wandering the palace library, she met Princess Sofiana, a fellow outcast. Sofiana, too, had found herself sidelined by Prince Leonhard, and in her, Elizabeth discovered a true kindred spirit. It was through Sofiana's connections that Elizabeth began corresponding with nobles from other lands. One of her closest pen pals was Liam Sanharl, the 3rd prince of the Kingdom of Sensual. His letters, filled with insights into foreign lands and customs, were a lifeline for Elizabeth, who otherwise had little connection to the outside world. That day, among the letters, Liam's was the first she opened. Inside, she found a charming recipe for airbray, a type of bread from his homeland. Reading it, she marveled at how simple the recipe seemed and how opulent their kitchens must be to produce such fine goods. She couldn't wait to try it herself and was even eager to send the recipe to her father, knowing it would delight him. After thoroughly examining Liam's letter, Elizabeth turned to Elsa and asked her to prepare the materials for a reply. Elsa, always efficient, quickly returned with parchment, quill, ink, and an envelope. As Elizabeth thanked her, she couldn't help but ask what Elsa thought of Liam's kingdom. Though Elizabeth only knew of the country from Liam's letters, she found herself intrigued by its customs and culture. Lost in thought, Elizabeth began drafting her reply. As she wrote, she may have mentioned things she shouldn't have, but in the cold, calculating palace, these letters were her only hope for escape and connection to a better world. She expressed her gratitude for the recipe and hinted at her growing isolation. However, the quiet joy Elizabeth found in her correspondence was short-lived. Not long after, her life took a darker turn. Elizabeth was abruptly thrown into a distant, damp dungeon, accused of treason. Her own husband, Prince Leon Hart, branded her a traitor, though Elizabeth could not fathom why. She was bewildered as to why she had been locked away, for she had done nothing wrong. Yet, Leon Hart saw things differently. As he confronted her in the prison, his voice dripped with anger. He ordered her to remain silent unless spoken to and then motioned to his knight, Stanley. In Stanley's hands was the damning piece of evidence, a black envelope from Liam. Leon Hart's eyes bore into hers as he accused her of conspiring with other kingdoms. Shocked and terrified, Elizabeth pleaded her innocence, insisting she had merely been corresponding for the sake of conversation, nothing more. She had never intended to betray the kingdom of Albert, the land she now called home. But Leon Hart refused to listen. His mind had already been made up, convinced that Elizabeth's letters were part of a plot to usurp the throne. He sneered, asking if she truly thought she could seize control of the kingdom. Her protests fell on deaf ears. Desperate, Elizabeth continued to beg for his understanding, assuring him that she had never written anything that would harm the kingdom. But Leon Hart, consumed by suspicion and distrust, dismissed her pleas as mere excuses. Turning his back on her, he coldly declared that he no longer believed anything she said. He walked away, leaving Elizabeth's desperate cries echoing through the dungeon walls. Days passed, and Elizabeth remained in the dark, damp cell, utterly alone. Her once bright hope for a better life had crumbled, replaced by despair. Without anyone to hear her, she was left to rot in that dreadful dungeon, her innocence unacknowledged, her fate sealed by a husband who would never listen. A whole month passed in the dungeon, where Elizabeth was fed nothing but stale bread and murky water. The girl, utterly exhausted, could barely bring herself to eat. She remained bewildered, unable to grasp why she had been punished so severely when she had done nothing wrong. All she had sought was the simple companionship of others. Was that truly forbidden? As her strength waned, so did her hope. She thought endlessly about how her life had unraveled, unable to comprehend the cruel twist of fate. Elizabeth's gaze fell upon the seal from Liam's last letter, the one that had been her undoing. She remembered the conversations she'd had with Elsa, her maid, about the distant land where Liam resided. The girl had been eager to learn everything about his kingdom, curious about every little detail of his life. Now, those letters seemed like faint echoes of a life that had slipped through her fingers. Suddenly, Elizabeth's vision blurred, her head spinning as she wondered if her life could have been different. The weight of regret pressed heavily upon her as her consciousness faded. There were so many things she wished she had known, so many questions that would remain unanswered. Soon, she closed her eyes for the last time, succumbing to the darkness of the dungeon. But then, in an unexpected twist, Elizabeth woke up. She found herself in a bright, sunlit room, filled with toys and the sound of birds chirping outside the window. Dazed and confused, she sat up, noticing that her hands were much smaller than they should be. Startled, she touched her face, wondering why she was crying, as she was old enough to control her emotions. But when she stood and caught sight of her reflection in the mirror, she saw a small, vulnerable girl staring back at her. It took a moment for the shock to set in. Elizabeth had somehow returned to her childhood. She couldn't comprehend it at first, her legs giving way beneath her as she knelt before the mirror, gazing at the reflection of her younger self. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of the impossible situation. She was no longer the concubine of Prince Leon Hart. She had been transported to a time when everything was different, when her life had yet to spiral into chaos. After a few moments of stunned silence, Elizabeth realized she needed to confirm what had happened. If she truly had returned to her past, she had to see her family, to know what was happening in this timeline. Without bothering to change out of her pajamas, she bolted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Just as she reached the door, she heard a familiar voice greeting someone. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it possible? Could it really be him? Before she could process what was happening, the door creaked open. A maid entered the room, her head bowed, apologizing for her lateness. The maid explained that she had been attending to the laundry as ordered by Madame, but Elizabeth wasn't listening. She was too focused on the figure in front of her, her first maid, Lana. Overcome with emotion, Elizabeth ran to her and embraced her tightly, tears streaming down her face. Lana, taken aback by the sudden display of affection, hesitated for a moment before hugging Elizabeth back. Concern filled her voice as she asked her young mistress if she had had a terrible dream. Elizabeth, still crying, nodded, explaining that she had experienced the most frightening dream, one that felt far too real. In this dream, Elizabeth had been trapped in a loveless marriage, made the 10th concubine to a prince who cared nothing for her. The dreadful fate had all stemmed from a marriage of convenience arranged by her family, primarily to secure control over the Finra mines. Lana, Elizabeth's loyal maid, had been the only one who objected to the marriage, protesting against it until the very end. For years older than Elizabeth, Lana had always been fiercely protective of her, and Elizabeth had always held her dear. Now, back in this strange second chance at life, Elizabeth clung to Lana, more grateful than ever for her presence. Though she still didn't fully understand how or why she had returned to this time, one thing was certain: this time, she would take control of her own fate. Smiling, Elizabeth turned to the maid and said, "With you by my side, all my worries disappear, and my heart feels light." The two embraced once more, and Lana, with a gentle smile, promised that the next time Elizabeth had a terrible dream, she would be the first to rush in and comfort her. Laughing, Elizabeth replied, "You're 1,000 times better than anyone else," and Lana, equally warm, assured her that the girl could always rely on her, no matter the situation. As the maid began helping her dress, Elizabeth suddenly stopped her and asked what day it was, eager to orient herself. She also inquired if she could have breakfast with her father. Lana's face lit up with a smile as she answered, "It's the first day of the water month, my lady." "Surely you haven't forgotten already?" Without waiting for a reply, Lana continued, reminding Elizabeth that they had just celebrated her 7th birthday, a grand affair where even her brothers had returned for the occasion. Elizabeth, surprised, nodded as the memories of that time flooded back. Lana further explained that the Lord had gone to a nearby town and the brothers had returned to the front lines, as they were often stationed there. They wouldn't be back for a while. Elizabeth felt a rush of understanding as Lana spoke. She remembered that Finra's territory bordered the perilous forest of eternal darkness, where dangerous monsters were born. The first generation of the Franz family had earned the title of McGrave for their heroic deeds in slaying the dragons that once terrorized the kingdom, and in return, they were granted the responsibility of defending these lands from the monsters that emerged from the forest. The Margrave's duty, even now, was to ensure these beasts never reached the royal capital. Elizabeth knew all too well the harshness of her family's work. Her brothers faced constant danger on the front lines. The monsters were not always containable, and when they broke through, they caused chaos, destroying homes and infrastructure, hindering the progress of the towns they ravaged. Living so far from the capital, there was little in the way of entertainment, and the mines were the main source of Finra's strength. However, the mines were far from safe. Monsters lurked even there. Yet, it was in these mines that precious ores were found, essential for crafting weapons to battle the very beasts that plagued their lands. Soon, Lana finished helping Elizabeth dress and tidy her hair. Elizabeth then asked where everyone else in the household was. Lana informed her that Madame Louise and Mr. Rachel were preparing to go shopping after breakfast. The mention of Madame Louise immediately soured Elizabeth's mood, for she remembered her cruel stepmother all too well. Louise, in Elizabeth's eyes, was the embodiment of evil. She had been the one to arrange the disastrous engagement to Prince Leon Hart, declaring it a great triumph for the family, despite the prince's infamous reputation. Elizabeth recalled how aristocratic society had shunned her, with rumors swirling about Leon Hart's numerous concubines, particularly the fact that Elizabeth herself had been his 10th. No noble daughter wanted anything to do with her, and so Elizabeth had lived a friendless existence. Her stepmother, in a rush to rid herself of Elizabeth, had pushed her into the marriage without proper preparation and, after the wedding, spread cruel rumors about her, cutting ties completely. Elizabeth had never understood why her stepmother harbored such animosity. As her thoughts wandered to her past life, Elizabeth reflected on the fleeting joy she had found in the royal palace. While Leon Hart had ignored her, she had formed bonds with others. Her friendship with Princess Sophiana had been a bright spot, as were the letters from her pen pals. Those relationships had offered her a brief respite from the isolation and bitterness of her life. But her days were still overshadowed by the whims of Prince Leon Hart, and before long, her life had ended tragically, without ever reaching the happiness she had longed for. Now, sitting before the mirror, Elizabeth watched as Lana finished styling her hair. The reflection staring back at her was one of a girl who had just been given a second chance, a rare opportunity to change her fate. Elizabeth, filled with a renewed sense of purpose, thanked Lana for her help and finally came to terms with the truth: she had indeed returned to the past. This realization sparked something deep within her. The Lord had granted her another chance, and with it, the possibility of a different future. Having recalled key information from her past life, Elizabeth now had a clear understanding of the events that would unfold in the future. Filled with newfound determination, she turned to Lana with a smile and confidently declared, "I can do anything." Lana, a bit startled by the sudden burst of enthusiasm, asked what Elizabeth meant. The girl, her resolve unwavering, replied that she would find happiness in this life and ensure things would change for the better. Avoiding the disastrous engagement to Prince Leon Hart was her top priority, and to do so, she needed to focus on developing the Finra lands. If she could strengthen her family's position through innovation and growth, she would be too preoccupied with responsibilities to be forced into another unfavorable match. Lana smiled, noting that now that Elizabeth had changed, she could finally go down for breakfast, as she hadn't eaten herself due to handling some urgent tasks. Despite being Elizabeth's personal maid, Lana often found herself pulled into additional duties from others in the household. This created an awkward pause between the two, but Elizabeth quickly diffused the tension by holding out her hands and giggling. She gently took Lana's hands, apologized for any inconvenience, and suggested they head to breakfast right away. She even insisted that Lana should finish her work early that day so she, too, could eat in peace. Lana, visibly pleased, thanked Elizabeth, touched by her thoughtfulness. The Margrave of Finra's family was quite influential, primarily because of their control over rare minerals found in the territory's mines. Elizabeth's father, Lyd, was the head of the family, and she had two older brothers, Kite, the eldest, and Alt, the middle son. Their household also included Lyd's second wife, Louise, and Elizabeth's half-sister, Rachel. Elizabeth's mother had tragically died when she was just 3 years old, leaving a void in the family that deeply affected both her father and brothers. The Finra family, once powerful and respected, had fallen from grace due to a series of political machinations. Elizabeth's grandfather, a celebrated hero who had once slain dragons and saved the kingdom, had been wounded in battle. Despite his heroism, the family's political standing was gradually stripped away, with their land's budget cut and their soldiers taken away. The cause of this downfall, Elizabeth had learned, was the result of a personal vendetta by the Minister of Finance. The minister had once sought an engagement with a woman who ultimately chose Elizabeth's grandfather, and in revenge, he used his influence to undermine the Finra family's status. Elizabeth's father, Lyd, had always loved his first wife deeply and never intended to remarry. However, the pressure from higher-ranking aristocrats, combined with his gentle nature, forced him into a second marriage with Louise. Louise, an ambitious woman, quickly took control of the household, and her daughter Rachel followed in her footsteps, making Elizabeth's life even more difficult. Finally, Elizabeth made her way downstairs to the dining room. Her stepmother, Louise, and stepsister, Rachel, were already seated at the table. Upon entering, Elizabeth greeted them politely, saying, "Good morning." Both women looked up from their meal, clearly surprised to see her. Louise was the first to speak, commenting with a cold smile, "You're a little late, Elizabeth. I suppose you've overslept again." Rachel, with a smirk, added, "Our little sister is so naive, she doesn't even know how to follow basic norms." Though Elizabeth inwardly bristled at their condescending remarks, she knew better than to let them provoke her. She was, after all, still a child in their eyes, and reacting would only give them more power. She calmly walked over to the table and sat down, reminding herself that the key to dealing with them was to ignore their behavior as much as possible. Soon after, Lana appeared with another plate of food, placing it gently in front of Elizabeth. Overjoyed by the maid's presence and the warm meal, Elizabeth smiled brightly and thanked her, saying, "Thank you so much, Lana." Sitting at the table with her unkind stepmother and stepsister no longer felt like the unbearable trial it once had. Louise sat at the table, her irritation barely concealed as she watched Elizabeth. The sight of her stepdaughter, always so compliant and meek, now behaving more self-assured, grated on her nerves. Elizabeth, sensing her stepmother's piercing gaze, remained silent, refusing to acknowledge it. Finally, Louise broke the silence with a disdainful laugh, remarking how accustomed she had become to the meager food at their estate compared to the lavish meals served in the capital. Rachel, quick to echo her mother, sighed dramatically and complained that she longed for tastier fare, lamenting how much she missed the food from their former home. Elizabeth quietly observed the plates in front of them. Though the food was prepared with care and skill, it was clear that her stepmother and half-sister found it inadequate. It was true that the dishes lacked the extravagance of what she had experienced while living at the royal palace, where she had tasted delicacies she would never have encountered at home. Yet, despite those indulgences, Elizabeth found herself preferring the simple, wholesome bread baked by the family's cook. Even the modest loaf before her now filled her with gratitude, especially after the harrowing experience of being served moldy, stale bread in the dungeon. Compared to that, today's meal was a feast. Just as Elizabeth was about to take a bite of the bread, a memory struck her. Lana's stomach had been growling earlier, and the maid had likely skipped her own meal to serve them. Concerned for her loyal maid, Elizabeth turned to Lana and whispered her thanks for serving her, adding softly that now it was Lana's turn to eat. Lana's face lit up with joy at the kind gesture, but as she began to step away to find her own meal, Louise abruptly intervened. Her stepmother strode over, her voice sharp as she declared, "It's well past time for the servants to eat, Lana. You're late." Elizabeth's temper flared, and she rose from her seat, glaring at her stepmother in disbelief. "What are you even saying?" she demanded, her voice filled with indignation. Louise shot Lana a vicious look, causing the maid to tremble with fear. In a small, shaky voice, Lana murmured that it was fine, that she had already eaten, and there was no need to trouble herself further. But Elizabeth would not be placated. Fury burned inside her at the unfairness of it all. How could her stepmother deny the maid a simple meal after she had worked so hard without a break? The injustice was too much to bear. Without hesitation, Elizabeth grabbed the remaining half of her bread and offered it to Lana, insisting that she take it at the very least. Louise's face twisted with anger as she turned to her stepdaughter. "This is unacceptable," she hissed. "Put the bread back immediately. Where did you get this kind of upbringing, treating servants like equals?" Elizabeth's patience snapped. She glared at her stepmother and, with uncharacteristic boldness, replied in a firm, rough voice, "Stepmother." The single word, spoken with defiance, made Louise bristle with indignation. "You had better watch your tongue, young lady," she warned, her voice icy. But Elizabeth was not intimidated. "With all due respect," she said, meeting her stepmother's gaze head-on, "the obedient girl you could push around no longer exists. As of today, I will not stand by and allow mistreatment, especially of someone like Lana, who works tirelessly. And if I'm not mistaken, it was under your orders that she was forced to attend to additional tasks during her designated mealtime, wasn't it?" Louise's expression shifted from anger to shock.